Good afternoon from Columbus, Ohio, which is the traditional homelands of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. I am Stephen John Quaye, and I'm currently an associate professor in the higher education and student affairs program at The Ohio State University. Thank you so much for joining us for the third conversation in the ASHE Presidential Webinar series, convened by current ASHE President D.L. Stewart. This webinar is being captioned live, and those captions can be accessed by clicking the CC button in your menu bar. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the ASHE website in the next week. Throughout the webinar, you can pose questions to the panelists by using the Q&A feature in the menu bar. They may answer questions throughout as they come in or at the end. The purpose of the ASHE Presidential Webinar series is to engage leaders on critical issues about equity related to space and place in higher education. Let me distinguish between place and space. According to Eric Jacobson, places are imbued with memories and experiences, whereas spaces are blank slates that have yet to be transformed into places and may, in fact, never morph into places. Places help us develop our identities, but spaces give us the space, so to speak, to reflect on what is possible with our identities. We need both places and spaces. Within the sustainability movement, educators often do not attend to the place for social identities within the movement. This placelessness renders people of color and those with other and multiple minoritized identities within the movement invisible and often does not center their priorities and needs. In this third webinar, I invited 4 scholars and activists to discuss the challenges and possibilities of making sustainability education more socially just and equitable. Before introducing the panelists, I want to make 2 additional points. First, this webinar is happening at a timely moment as the UN just released its climate report this week, and the details are pretty grim for our environment. Second, I want to acknowledge Indigenous peoples who for centuries have pushed us to take better care of the land and each other. Specifically, the Red Deal is an Indigenous collective response to an extension of the Green New Deal. The Red Deal centers Native leaders and their knowledges. I am grateful to those who pushed me to recognize the vast and deep contributions of Indigenous peoples to sustainability. Having provided this context, let me now introduce our panelists. Noah Drezner is Professor of Higher Education, Program Director for Higher and Post-Secondary Education, and Principal Investigator of the new Saduka Lab at Teachers College, Columbia University. His work focuses on philanthropy and fundraising in higher education, with a particular attention to how a person's social identities affect their giving to higher education and ways post-secondary institutions can engage their alumni in more inclusive ways. Oren Pismoni-Levy is Associate Professor and Director of the International and Comparative Education Program at Teachers College, Columbia University. He also serves as a director of the Center for Sustainable Futures at Teachers College. His work centers on how social movements challenge schools and education systems worldwide. Specifically, he is interested in 3 education-related movements: international assessment of student achievement, sexual orientation and gender identity education, and environmental and sustainability education. Christina Torres is a doctoral student in the Science Education Program at Teachers College, Columbia University. She is also a 2020-2021 Zankel Fellow for the Climate Change Education for New York City project, and is affiliated with the Center for Sustainable Futures. She's also an adjunct professor at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where she teaches an ecology and environmental problems course to students that want to pursue sustainable fashion. Her research interests center on utilizing local biodiversity to integrate ecology concepts and sustainable thinking into urban classrooms. And last but not least, Carrot Wang is an undergraduate student activist at The Ohio State University. She is majoring in sustainable economics and business and strategic communication at OSU. She's committed to restoring the broken relationships among students, non-humans, and our ecosystems through a strong attention to intersectionality within sustainability. As an activist, she spearheaded Time for Change, an effort to mobilize the Ohio State community towards sustainability. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. I'm really looking forward to it. Before I pose the first question, I want to ask each panelist to briefly say hello, recognize where you are joining from, and share anything you want us to know about you and your work. Let's start with you, Christina.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Stephen. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina. You can call me Christina or Chris. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am currently Zooming in from Washington Heights, which is historically Lenape land. And I'm super excited to be here today. Thank you all for joining wherever you're Zooming from. And I'm really excited to talk about equity and sustainability education.
Thank you, Chris. Oren, why don't you go next?
Hello, everybody. I'm Owen, and similar to Christina, I'm speaking to you from Morning Heights area. Specifically, I'm on Columbia campus. And it is important to recognize that the Lenape people and land. And one thing I want you to know is that I'm really excited about sustainability, and I'm even more excited that in higher education, we're having this space within the ASHE community. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you, President D.L. Stewart, for initiating this very important conversation.
Thank you so much. Carrot, let's go to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Juan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also calling from Columbus, Ohio. And I'd like to invite all of us to appreciate and honor the indigenous people's resilience, sovereignty, and millennia-long dedication to nurturing and sustaining a harmonious, reciprocal, and respectful relationships to our natural world and our non-human relatives. And I also encourage all of us to show solidarity, standing together in addressing the crisis of our time. I'm very looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much. And finally, Noah.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Noah Drezner. As Stephen mentioned, I use he, him pronouns. And like Christina and Oren, I'm on the Lenape, and Wappinger people's land. And I think it's also important to note, being in Morningside Heights, we are also on the outskirts of Harlem and the importance of communities of color in many social movements, including the sustainability movement that has been invigorated and seen as a site of starting in Harlem for across the nation.
Thank you so much, Noah. And thank you to all of you for those introductions and letting us know where you're from and the ties to Indigenous peoples, which I think is really important. So I really appreciate setting that up for us today. So let's go to our first opening question. So as a reminder to folks in the audience, the focus of this session is on equity within the sustainability movement. So in order to help the audience grasp sustainability generally, as well as the potential gaps in equity within the movement, I want each of you to talk about one or two lessons you have learned from your work so far. Let's begin with you, Noah.
Great, I'm so excited to talk about this. I think as we set up this conversation, there's certainly a need to be critical of the sustainability movement from a perspective of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. However, just like studying educational attainment, where you can study marginalized communities through a deficit lens or through an empowerment lens, here too it's important to study and understand the motivations of those activists of color who are involved in the movement and how their identities impact their engagement, as well as how the movement is impacted by their identities as well. So I think my lesson is, yes, we need to be critical, but we also have to acknowledge that there is a lot about one social identity that is brought to the movement, and the movement is impacted by that.
Thank you for that, Noah. I especially appreciate the point you mentioned about, acknowledging the role of identity, and in particular with activists of color. So I appreciate you naming that as an important lesson that you've learned from your work. Carrot, what about you?
For me, I have learned that the present issues, or I would say crisis, like the climate emergency, gender, economic, racial inequality, and injustice are symptoms of a chronic disease that is now embedded in the DNA of every corner of the world. It's not just a matter of protecting polar bears, or it does not only matter to the regions that are far away from us. I believe that this disease is stemmed from beyond the systems, like from the ideologies of supremacy, specifically human supremacy, white supremacy, egoism, and endless taking on this finite planet without giving back. And also an indifference to life, especially the life who have long been exploited, marginalized, and unheard. And I think this harm is, as we've seen in the IPCC report, and also the alarms have been raised by frontline communities for decades, have shown that the harms are planetary and cumulative. And I think right now is time for us to respond to these alarms by taking adequate action immediately. I also believe that the fact that the state of our climate has only been getting worse since the Paris Agreement shows us that such piecemeal incremental approaches, such as holding on to cutting greenhouse gas emissions or transitioning to clean energy, relying on those efforts alone without addressing the root causes, will not cure this disease nor put out the fire. I believe that what we need is a rapid, radical, and deep transformation to a world where every life is valued equally, and where a world that is full of places with life and spirit over spaces that are empty at heart. I think this transformation, in order to accomplish this transformation, we need to hear and let diverse set of voices to guide us and lead us, especially those who are being silenced and marginalized, those who have been the change agents of our planet and also our humanity. I think this change should happen at all levels, from local to global, and across the entire spectrum, from the ways that we produce energy and to our ways of being. And I think that all of us has a role to play, and we can do this together to turn things around.
I really appreciate that, Carrot. I want to just emphasize two of the things that you said that really stood out to me, that I'm hoping that we can come to throughout today's session as well, and I think we will. One of the words that you used in describing the impact of some of the lessons you've learned from sustainability is you used the word cumulative. That I think sometimes we think these are one-off issues when in fact they are impacting our communities cumulatively. That means historically over time. And so I just appreciate you naming that. Something else that you said too that stood out to me was you talked about like symptoms. And something that I think we struggle with doing is like, we often address symptoms without actually addressing the root of an issue. And so when we're only addressing symptoms, the root of the issue remains unchanged. And so I really appreciate you also talking about that. So thank you for those opening comments. Oren, let's go to you next on this first question.
So coming to this field from social science, I'm trained as a sociologist. One of the first lessons I learned while working with educators on sustainability is that people hold different definitions of the basic term, sustainability or sustainable development. And if we had more time and Stephen will allow, I will do an exercise with the audience, really trying to unpack how all of us here on the call interpret the concept of sustainability. So trust me that I did it with 1,400 educators in New York once and twice and in different workshops. And I will tell you that one of the lessons from this exercise is that people bring different definitions of the term to the table. And unless we really unpack what it means to be sustainable or to do sustainability work, we won't be able to really make progress in this area. And here is the point. Some people define sustainability as recycling or reusing of material or reducing plastic, which is great. Others look at air quality, water quality, and you can see how different communities will engage with different topics. So one of my lessons is that the beginning, the starting point for any meaningful conversation on sustainability should really start with what sustainability is all about. And I'm usually trying to educate the people I'm working with to think about sustainability in the broader terms. So to think about it as three pillars: the people, the planet, and prosperity, or the balance between the environmental, social, and economic pillars. We can talk more about it later on, but you can see that through these different definitions, people can bring topics like environmental justice and food insecurity. So it's really more than just the 3 R's: recycling, reuse, reduce.
Thank you for that, Oren. I was just typing into the chat box one of the quotes that you said, because I think it's helpful to frame. Today as well, you said, any meaningful conversation on sustainability should start with what sustainability is about. So again, we can't address an issue if we don't know what we're talking about, right? And so I think that's the gist of your comments, which I appreciate. Christina, what are your thoughts to this conversation?
Yeah, so I come from a science background. I studied beetles in the Amazon rainforest for years. And so much of what I learned basically is integrating this intersectionality component into my sustainability worldview. That it is, similarly to what Karen said, it's so much bigger than just, you know, polar bears in Arctic. And I think the biggest thing that I learned is that when we're talking about issues of diversity and equity in sustainability and sustainability education, these are not separate things. We don't have the movement, period, if we don't have equity in the movement and everybody's voices are not being heard equally. And when we're talking about the term diversity, it is also, it's about race, but we're also talking about background, gender, age, sexuality, and even discipline. Because if we're talking about solving the biggest problem we are facing in the world today, it's going to take interdisciplinary solutions. So I think that is my biggest thing that I've learned so far.
Thanks for that. So again, equity is the center, that is the movement. To rephrase Christina's words, like without it, there is no sustainability movement. So this is not an add-on, it's not a piecemeal thing, but it's central to it. So I appreciate that. Let's go to the second question here. And maybe, Oren, one of the things that you said was, if I allow space for you to engage with the audience. And so this might be a place to maybe briefly do that, but in this second question. So the question here to you, Oren, is, one of the things I said when I introduced you was that you direct the Center for Sustainable Futures. I want you to help the audience understand the work that you do at the center. And then like specifically, what do you and those of you who work in the center see as the pressing needs within sustainability education?
Okay, thank you for the question and for allowing me to talk more about the center. As you can just see from the previous conversation, I'm working very closely with both Noah and Christina, and we have wonderful conversations like this on a regular basis. So I'm really happy that everybody can see a little bit about the culture of the discussion that we have. The Center for Sustainable Futures at Teachers College was established 2 years ago. It was a process. It took us 5 years to take it off the ground. And in a series of strategic planning, we came up with the following vision. We envision a regenerative world in which we can achieve the balance of the 3 pillars I mentioned earlier: the planet, the people, and prosperity. Our mission is to promote learning, awareness, attitude, and skills for people to work individually, but also collectively toward long-term sustainability of complex living systems. And what does it mean? What do we do? So we do research. We offer courses at Teachers College. We also offer training online through webinars and other mediums. And we offer a lot of service, pro bono service to the community. And I would like actually today to focus on the links between the different things that we do. So I'll give you 2 examples. One of them is a wonderful program we launched last year called Youth at the Center. And Chris is one of the co-leaders of that program. Basically, we identified that there is a lot of youth activism and energy around climate and sustainability. And one of the things that they are looking for, we learned through our meeting with them, is that they are looking for more direct contact with the source of knowledge, the universities, where people study climate and they know the facts and they have the data. Kids really want to learn what do we know so they can take it and act on it. So Chris and others like Erika Kessler and Raksha Vasudevan and Mariana, a bunch of amazing team developed 2 different programs for kids in the city, and we had wonderful activities we done throughout the year. So that's targeting youth. The other flagship program is our research practice partnership with the New York City Department of Education Office of Sustainability. We are offering pro bono research services to the Department of Education in order to inform and improve their practices. New York City is one of the only cities in the world that have a mandate that require every school to appoint a coordinator for sustainability. And we, through our research, quantitative, qualitative, focus group, interviews, whatever, we are improving their practice by showing them evidence about what works, floating some new ideas, and bringing some new initiatives from the literature, stuff that we read. So these are the 2, I think, programs that demonstrate what we do. But I want to point on maybe a couple of needs. I think that was Stephen's second part of the question. Stephen, do you have time to talk about 2 needs? Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So need number 1, I would say, is to increase the awareness across the education field. So all disciplines and subfields see themselves doing sustainability work. In other words, sustainability is not for the science educators, and that's it. The social studies people have something to do, the economists have something to do, the policy studies have something to do, even higher education scholars have something to do with this. And look at us today, we are meeting and talking about that. Need number 2 is to diversify the movement, okay? We have to bring more voices to the table because this will allow not only too many concerns to surface, it will also allow us to be more creative when we think about solutions. Think about group dynamics. When we have a diverse group of people working together, we are much more creative. And the third need, I think we should talk about is that we need more of a long-term partnership between higher education institutions and local agencies, governmental, non-governmental, that are working to promote sustainability education. Through this partnership, there is a lot of possibilities and a lot of benefits for both sides. If people want to hear more about that, I'm more than happy to talk about it in the Q&A.
Thank you for that really rich overview of the work that you've been doing, Oren. Christina, I want to bring you in here as well too, because I know you also work within the center. So are there things that Oren said has not said that you wanted to bring about in the work that you've been doing as well?
Great, yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I'd love to zoom in on this Youth at the Center project that we did and the path that we took to create it. Most specifically, how youth activists are truly at the center of this movement, and what does equity look like in a virtual world? Because these were kind of the 2 questions we were playing with when we started this in September 2020. Obviously, we did the whole year virtually, all of this programming virtually, and me and another graduate student, Mariana, at the beginning of the semester, were just tasked to interview youth activists, to as many as you can and figure out what we as the Center of Sustainable Futures, how can we as an academic institution, a higher education institution, interface with youth in a K-12 space and in an activism space. And we had this seminal event where we got them all together in December, and we ended up calling it Youth at the Center, which turned out to be the name of the programming we created after the event. And we identified all of these different needs, and that's why these two sub-programs were created under the umbrella of Youth at the Center. Like Oren previously said, a huge need that was identified is that, when we're talking about climate and sustainability, this can't just be a footnote in a science class. And students really need to understand the different aspects of sustainability to be part of the movement. So that's where this Climate Action 101 program came about, which engaged middle school students virtually. We did bi-weekly workshops, and they completed a project on their own. And we got all different types of projects, from websites to blogs, artwork, their own interpretation of the movement, stuff that they were learning that they were not being engaged with in schools. Then we had our other sub program, which is bridging policymakers to activism. And this was with youth activists in high schools. And we basically conducted this survey where we got over 140 responses from New York City youth all throughout the public school system that we created with these youth activists to support the work that they're already doing. And what we've learned, which we also learned from talking to middle school students and younger students, is that students are not being engaged in sustainability education in their classrooms. They want to be involved. They're getting their informal education on Instagram, social media, whatever they're reading at home with their parents, but they're not learning it in school. Which is where our youth activists play such an important role, even in their classrooms. They're doing some really, really interesting peer-to-peer education stuff, especially in a virtual world. All of our youth activists, even though they miss doing a lot of our work in person, and of course I also miss doing our work in person, all of them have said that they are able to cast a wider net with their activism and engage students throughout the entire 5 boroughs of New York City in ways that they didn't think to do otherwise pre-COVID. We have people with blogs, website, organizing virtual events. And even from the perspective of Youth at the Center, we wouldn't be able to do what we did in an in-person world. Across our programs, we had students representing 4 boroughs of New York City and Hudson Valley from all different backgrounds and all different age groups. So really, when we're thinking about it, like equity and sustainability education, we also need to think about how the world has changed because of COVID, and how we can use virtual tools to push equity forward, and the gaps that are definitely still there in sustainability education in a post-COVID world.
I'm really excited to hear this youth in action be talked about so much, because I think sometimes I struggle with how much we rely upon students to essentially be doing all of the work to save us, right, from what's happening in our world. And at the same time, it's often activists, like things often don't happen without the labor of activists, right? So it's this double sort of like edged approach there. So I just appreciate us naming youth, because I think often their voices are not often centered or included. So I appreciate that. This is a good segue into a question I have for you, Karen. So I know that you are an activist, like that's how you identify, and you've done some work on OSU's campus around these issues. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. So what do you think are the core issues that you've addressed as an activist related to sustainability, and what have you learned from your activism?
Thank you. I think like everyone else has just said, I've also seen a lack of engagement and inclusivity in this movement. A lot of people see those who care about environments or environmentalists as tree huggers, as vegans or hippies. I do love hugging trees, but similar to Christina, my goal has been to help to make the movement more accessible, inclusive, and engaging, where People from all walks of life with all backgrounds are encouraged to walk in and find their role, their place in this movement and connect with their own power, whether that be youth, those who from economically low income backgrounds, marginalized racial identities. So my work particularly has been around creating two-way communication, spreading message of change and building partnerships, especially with the groups who are not yet at the table. I've learned that collaboration and local organizing are two powerful, renewable resources. Like Professor Oren, who brings together people together through research. Time for Change, a group I was part of, is a student-led collective effort, a place where student organizations bring together events centered around the topics of sustainability, and also where students get to participate, not only participate, but also to connect and also share their voices. For example, we have an annual photo contest that's been gaining so much attention, it's been so successful. It's basically students share photos that resonate with them under a common theme, and their stories, their insights that's been so inspiring to me personally, and it's been shared so many everywhere on social media particularly. I think to me, this is where community building and solidarity starts, because each of our voice, our backgrounds, it's so unique and so deserving to be uplifted. And we do so by asking who is here and who is missing and why they're missing and what are the threads that really connect us, and how to connect those threads. As for local organizing, like many of us, I was hopeless about the scale and the scope of the issues. But after involving in local advocacy, I have come to realize that the power of acting on a piece of problem that's right in front of us, that's impacting our daily life, because we can drive change from the ground up. For example, stopping the installation of another power plant, growing more community gardens, and celebrating diverse cultures in our community. As someone who's not from Columbus, I have found a sense of belonging from joining like many groups who work to enrich our communities. So those are my two takeaways.
Thank you for that. I'll just reiterate the questions that you asked, Carrot. You said who's here, who's missing, and to me, even more importantly, why are they missing, right? Because often people are missing not just by chance. It's often intentionally, right? So I really appreciate you asking those three questions. Again, who's here, who's missing, and why are they missing? So thank you for that. Noah, let's bring you into this conversation as well. When I introduced you, I know one of the things I said that the majority of your work has focused on philanthropy, fundraising, and pro-social behaviors more generally. So I'm wondering if you can talk with the audience about what do you see as the connections between these topics and equitable sustainability?
Well, first, very few people at ASHE probably know this, but my undergraduate degree is in Earth and Environmental Science with a focus on biogeochemistry. And my first publication on my CV
I did not know that.
See, my first publication on my CV is actually iodine 129 as a geologic tracer. So this has been a long time aspect of me, and I finally, decades gone by, and it's coming back into the center, and I'm really excited about it. But generally, I'm really interested in higher education as a public good. And I believe that social movements, philanthropy, volunteerism, and other pro-social behaviors can stem from and support the public good that higher education at its core is supposed to be. And if we look at social movements from a historic perspective, many were formed, grew, and matured within college campuses. And given my interest on how higher education impacts a person's volunteerism, thinking about the sustainability field movement within our field really makes sense to me. So my work, while focusing on philanthropy and fundraising, is really a case about how we understand social identities impact decisions to engage in pro-social behaviors. I like to use the definition of pro-social behaviors as voluntary actions to benefit society. So thinking about the sustainability movement and marginalized populations is really an extension of my core work. Most of it has been focusing on this case of philanthropy and fundraising for most of my career. But I really think that this is another case that needs to really be explored.
Great, thank you for that. And thank you for that definition too of pro-social behaviors. Yes, to your question, Teresa, it is the book by Alicia Garza that I was mentioning earlier. Thank you for asking that. So I want to make a little bit of a shift. It's not a big shift because this has come up a few times as folks have named specifically equity. Christina used the word equity. Carrot also talked about the role of equity in the movement. So I want to ask this question more directly. So thus far, the panelists have been talking about equity within the sustainability movement. I want to point out something that I often hear when I talk in particular to my colleagues of color about sustainability. And frankly, many of them say sustainability is a white issue or an issue where white people have taken over, often ignoring their particular needs as people of color, or even as indigenous peoples, right? And so often their needs are not taken into consideration within this as well, despite them being often at the forefront of these movements. And so, Oren, I want to start with you to this question. What do you say to that point about whiteness within the movement?
I will engage your question, Stephen, in a minute, but I just want to say something about what Noah was saying a minute ago. His research on identity and how identity play a role in pro-social behavior was very influential on a study that we are doing these days at the center, trying to understand what makes some teachers volunteer to be a sustainable coordinator in a system that doesn't pay for that. So we learned a lot about the role of identity, and Noah's book on this topic, on theories, really helped us to understand this. I just wanted to make a point about that to show the links between the conversations. But going back to the issue of equity that you posed, Stephen, it is important to remember a couple of things. One is that the modern environmental movement that emerged in the 60s was mostly based on observation of scientists. I'm thinking, for example, on the book of Rachel Carson, The Silent Spring, a book that we use a lot in my class. Back then, and still today, STEM fields were disproportionately white. And I suspect that that's one of the reasons that we see this kind of path dependency pattern, that the sustainability movement dealt more or focused more on topics that are considered to be concerning or alarming to the white majority. I believe that this also shaped the way we measure what it means to be engaged in the movement. So just as an example, when we have public opinion surveys, one of my areas is public opinion. And when we look at public opinions on engagement with sustainability, we see a lot of questions about recycling, consumption, reducing car use, moving to electric car, oppose or favor of taxes, or pitching the economy versus the environment. These are all questions that then shape our understanding of who is engaged more or less. But these questions are not neutral. These questions are embedded in very specific assumptions of what it means to be engaged. So if we want to go back to my point earlier today about the definition of sustainability, we need to broaden the perspective when we think about engagement, and we need to look about different campaigns that are happening across the country. Even if the people don't call themselves sustainability activists, they do sustainability work. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I have a contact with an activist mother in the Bronx that is really trying to promote the regulation around air quality and air pollution in the Bronx. She doesn't see herself as a sustainability person, but she's doing sustainability work. Same goes to the residents in Flint, Michigan. They are really worried, as they should, we should be worried about their health, given the condition of water in Flint. That's sustainability work. So we have a lot of groups, people of colors, community of colors around the country doing this kind of work. We just need to step back and broaden the umbrella and to include them in the conversation. We have a lot to learn from them about success, failure, framing, how they do the work. But I want to end with another data point. I looked at our research from 2019, Americans Endorse Climate Change Education, and I remembered we had a finding about race. And we found something very interesting. When you compare people of color to white respondents, people of color in the US are much more likely to support and endorse climate change education than white respondents. So it's not that they are not engaged. It's not that they don't care. We really need to unpack why this pattern is the way it is. Maybe they are experiencing climate change or associate their experience with climate change more than the white population. Or maybe there is something else. But I think we really need to step back and understand the dynamic that are shaping the movement as it is today. I hope, Stephen, that was at least of a starting point to answer your question. I think it's an important question that we should stay on.
Yeah, it was definitely a really important starting point. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to share that with us. One of the things that you said that I especially appreciate was that these communities that we've been talking about, communities of color, indigenous communities, they are doing the work and they may not be calling it sustainability, right? And so so part of that means, you know, it's the lesson that I take from that is your question of like why, right? And so sometimes movements are not seen for people with minoritized identities, and so they don't want to be labeled in that way or be attached to it because of the ways they've been excluded, right? So that might be one sort of reason for the why. And so, but I just appreciate you naming that they're doing the work, even if we're not calling it that, or if they're not calling it that, right? I want to bring in both Christina and Carrot to this conversation. Both of you identify as students. So Christina, a graduate student, and Carrot, an undergraduate student. I'm wondering, to this question around sustainability being steeped in whiteness, do you hear your peers talking about that or saying that to you? And if so, like, how do you respond to them? Let's start with you, Carrot.
Definitely. I believe that to care about the climate or climate change, all we really have to be is a human living on this planet, period. I think climate change is a human rights issue, a justice issue, and an equality issue. Because if you really pay attention, we're seeing that across the country and also the globe, the destructive facilities like pipelines and factories are killing and sickening the most vulnerable communities, their homes, their health, the water, access to water, clean air, and also their cultures and their identities, their community. We're seeing that highway systems are built across their homes, all in the name of urban development. We're also seeing underfunded schools in Black and Brown communities. We're seeing racial segregation, climate refugees, the list can go on. And from what I learned, the seeds of this problematic ideologies that I brought up earlier were planted by some privileged, most of them were white men, to serve others who look like them. But as we as a whole are teetering on the brink of utterly preventable catastrophe, I believe that those who are having privilege, who be enjoying the fruits of exploitation, should take more responsibility and be held more accountable. I think they should disarm themselves, acknowledge that if one suffers, eventually we all suffer. Similarly, if one thrives, we all do, because we are in this web of life. We are essentially part of nature. I think we really need to listen closely, and also work with the frontline community leaders on holistic solutions, the solutions that recognize the intersection of issues, because nobody knows better than the nuances of the struggles we face or the solutions to them than those who are directly affected. And I also think we need restoration, acknowledging and validating the trauma and feelings of those who have been underserved and harmed. We should not portray, for example, Indigenous communities as primitive, but instead to acknowledge the work that they have done in being the keepers of relationships. We need to bring them to the spotlight and let them guide us and illuminate the path to a better future. And also need another way of living and being that is rooted in relationships and compassion over commodities.
Thank you so much for that, Carrot. Rooted in relationships, and I think you said compassion over commodities. I really appreciate you ending there with your comments. So thank you for that. Christina, anything to add to build off of Carrot's points?
Yeah, actually, and it leads perfectly, your point about commodities leads perfectly into conversations I've had with both my peers and my students. I guess similarly to Oren, I've done exercises with my students, I always do at the beginning of every semester, where I try to have them define these words: eco-friendly, sustainability. And I have them write on a Post-it or in a virtual world, throw it up on a Jamboard, and we see what everybody comes up with. First thing that comes to mind. And what my students, and a lot of the times my peers, they will conjure images of, white social media influencers drinking drinks out of their reusable straws and posing with their reusable bags. It's social media activism. And they don't see anything beyond that. When they think of the word sustainable, that is what they think of, even though it's so much bigger than that. And I know, Oren, you touched on this issue of identity. And so many Indigenous folks, people of color, they are the basis, they are like of the grassroots of this movement, but they don't necessarily see them as such. And the people who are seeing themselves in the movement and who are part of the movement, they are not being held to the decision makers as the Instagram influencers with the reusable straws that are actually influencing my students, the youth that we work with, etc. So Stephen, to answer your question, how do I respond when I talk about this with my peers? It's that we need to do better and support the people that are doing better. And coming from the perspective of our work at the center with youth at the center, our youth activists know this, and they are hyper aware of this fact. They're part of a generation where they have grown up in a world where they have only known about this crisis, even though the crisis has always been happening. We've known climate change is a thing since the late 1800s. It hasn't been popularized until their generation, when they're born. And they have taken it into their own hands to educate their peers and do what they can. But at the end of the day, we and our work in sustainability education need to understand that we need to empower people and how important representation is in this movement, so people can actually see themselves within this movement. Because at the end of the day, if we're designing sustainable solutions without everyone involved, that is inherently unsustainable.
Yes, these last two, both of you, I really appreciate your concluding comments. I mean, all of what you said, but you both ended on these really, I think, poignant points. And so I just really appreciate the work that you're doing as students within the movement. So thank you both, Christina and Carrot, for those comments. We have about 8 minutes left here in our webinar. I'm gonna pause just briefly here to see if there's any questions from the audience. I will say that I'm very comfortable with silence. but I also want to be mindful that this is being recorded. So I'm actually not going to pause as long as I normally would. But I am going to pause a little bit here and just see if anybody has a question that they want to ask. Again, feel free to use the Q&A. You can also put it in the chat box if you have a question for the panelists. Thank you for that question, Catherine. There's a question from Catherine around, do you see more diversity now in the movement versus 5 years ago? And any of you can take that question.
I will start by saying that I'm actually waiting for a release of a new data set on environmentalism in the US that will enable us to compare 2020 with 2010, with 2000 and the early 90s around who is engaged in environmentalism in the US. So I don't know if there is anything else that looks at diversity. I know that this data set, the ISSP that I'm looking for, will have data on diversity. Christina, do you know anything from what we read on the education piece and youth activism?
I would say that I don't have any like specific data, so this is all anecdotal. But I would say we do work with a very diverse group of youth. It's all the next generation. I know I feel like I sound like a broken record when I speak, but you know, I think so many of the youth activists work with they make it their point to include everyone. So I would like to think so, especially with youth activists within the movement.
Thank you both for that answer to Catherine's question. I want to actually bring Noah into this as well too, because I know I didn't give you a chance to respond to the question. So Catherine asked a question about more diversity now versus 5 years ago, and then the previous question was around whiteness. And I'm wondering, Noah, do you have any thoughts to either of those questions?
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing me back in. First of all, I just want to say that it's difficult to answer a question last after people like Carrot, Christina, and Oren are giving such amazing answers and showing their scholarship and their activism so well. But I want to amplify a point that Carrot was saying in her answer and go a little bit beyond it. The degradation of our environment and the human involvement in the climate crisis can be easily linked to the oppression of white supremacy and colonialism and aspects of capitalism. So its connection to whiteness is absolutely clear to me.